The first time I saw Earth, I mistook it for a bargaining chip, blue-white marble, thin atmosphere, soft electromagnetic chatter, a garden world that should have been screaming military arrays, orbital forts, mass drivers, dread signatures, anything. Instead it whispered, weather satellites, civilian traffic control, navigation pings, 1,000 little voices talking over one another like a marketplace that had never heard the word siege. I stood in the oculus of the dawn of accords, my skin flushed a nervous violet beneath ceremonial bands, and listened to the room laugh. Look at them, Ambassador Vaikal said, spines along his jaw flaring in amusement. They're arguing. On the holopanel, a translated human broadcast scrolled past. Elected officials shouting, analysts interrupting, protesters. So many faces, so much noise. The alien interpreters softened the sharp edges of their speech, but even filtered it felt like chaos. Chaos was not strength. Chaos was a meal. My name is Sail, third record keeper of the near. I was sent to witness history and make it legible. That was my oath. That was my curse. Because the truth is, the room wasn't laughing at humans. Not really. They were laughing at the idea that a new species could matter. The Conclave had existed for 7,000 cycles, 37 member civilizations, each with their own myths about how the stars belonged to them. I had spent my entire adulthood documenting the quiet wars that happened before the ink dried on treaties, trade adjustments enforced by blockade, security partnerships that were occupations in velvet gloves, resource audits backed by orbital cannons. We called it stability. The human delegation called it extortion. We had invited Earth to the outer ring of conclave talks because the Tyrune Directorate wanted their helium-3 fields, because the Carvax Guild wanted their rare isotopes, because the Vesh Compact wanted a new buffer state between themselves and the Directorate. Earth was a useful variable in a stale equation, and everyone in the chamber could smell opportunity. They had sent one diplomat. One. A human woman in dark fabric with a small flag stitched to her shoulder. She stood at her podium like a soldier wearing civilian skin, hands folded, eyes scanning the chamber with the steady patience of a predator that has already chosen when to strike. When she spoke, her voice was calm, not submissive, calm like a planet. Earth declines the resource concessions, she said through the translation halo. We decline the protective fleet offer. We decline the clause allowing conclave inspection teams on our orbital platforms. Vaikal clicked his teeth. Inspection teams, he murmured. They have none. The Tyrune High Envoy, a creature of lacquered chitin and weaponized politeness, leaned forward. Then you decline membership. The chamber murmured approval. Membership was life. Trade lanes, medical data, navigational grants. A new species without it was strangled by a million gentle hands. The human diplomat didn't blink. Then we decline membership. Silence fell like a blade. I watched her, startled despite myself. Refusing the conclave was like refusing an atmosphere. The High Envoy's eyes narrowed into glittering slits. You misunderstand your position, Earth. I understand it precisely, she replied. You believe we are bluffing. The word bluffing rippled through the translation algorithms, converting into a dozen alien concepts: deceptive bargaining, false strength, an empty threat. In conclave politics, bluffing was common, expected, even. It was the grease that kept predation from becoming open feeding. The High Enver leaned back as if bored. You have no fleet. The woman's hands remained folded. We have what we need. Vaikal barked a laugh. Other delegates joined. The sound a cascade of contempt. Then the Tyrune High Enver delivered the line that would later be carved into memorial steel, because the conclave loves irony once it's survived it. Earth, he said, if you have what you need, you would not have come to beg. The human diplomat's gaze lifted slightly, as if looking past the chamber to something no one else could see. We didn't come to beg, she said. We came to warn you. I remember the shift in the air, then not literal, but psychological, the way a room feels when a creature stops pretending it's harmless. The conclave chair, an ancient Vesh named Sul, tapped the speaking stone with a claw. Record keeper, he said, gesturing to me. Mark Earth's refusal. Mark them as a non-compliant frontier. The Directorate will enforce the chart. My stylus hovered. My hands were steady because I trained them to be, but the skin along my ribs tightened. Enforcement meant blockade. Protective fleets. Inspections. Then the quiet stripping of sovereignty until a planet's people believed they had always been subjects. The Tyrone High Envoy rose, ceremonial mantle shifting like oil. We will dispatch a containment group within the cycle. You will reconsider once hunger explains reality. The human diplomat looked directly at him. If you come, she said, voice low enough that the translator nearly clipped it, bring enough to end it. Because if you come halfway, you will not leave. That should have triggered outrage. Instead, it triggered laughter again. We had all heard threats from small species. They always borrowed the language of giants. The High Envoy's mandibles twitched in something like pity. So dramatic. Do humans always speak in theater? In crises, she said, we speak in truth. Sul's voice thinned with irritation. This session is concluded. Escort Earth's delegate to the departure corridor. As guards approached her, she didn't resist. She let them guide her away, posture unbroken. She didn't look back at the chamber. She looked, one last time, at the holopanel where Earth glowed. The moment she crossed the threshold, my console chirped. A priority packet slid into my private channel coded in old Conclave military encryption, but not from any Conclave node. The signature was unfamiliar, the kind that made my throat dry. I glanced around. No one else reacted. My oath as record keeper demanded neutrality, but my survival instinct demanded curiosity. I opened it. The message contained only coordinates, Earth's orbit, and a time stop. Now, I rose before I realized I was moving. My chair clattered against the floor, the sound swallowed by the chamber's lingering chatter. I pressed through the side corridor toward the observation gallery reserved for minor functionaries, where the diplomatic theater could not see me and therefore could not stop me. The gallery was dim, lined with old viewing ports, actual glass, not holograms, because the Conclave chair liked tradition in his private spaces. I leaned to the nearest port. Earth hung in the void, serene, as if it hadn't just refused the empire of the stars. Then the void near it folded. At first, I thought it was a sensor glitch. Space does not ripple. It does not pucker like a well. But reality bent. A slow, deliberate distortion like a hand pushing through water. Breath stopped. A line of darkness appeared, lengthening, widening, not an object at first, but the absence of background stars, as if something massive was consuming the light behind it. Then the shape emerged, not a ship, a statement. It was longer than our Conclave station by an order of magnitude, its hull plated in matte obsidian that swallowed reflections. It carried no flamboyant fins, no ceremonial spires. It was brutally simple, an elongated wedge with edges like blades, as if designed to split planets by presence alone. Along its flanks, faint lights pulsed in sequences that made my translator buffer hesitate, patterns too complex to categorize as mere identification. And then my sensors, delayed by disbelief, caught up. Mass, obscene. Power signature, controlled, contained, terrifying. Gravitational footprint, stabilized by technology, but not name. It moved into Earth's orbit as if it had always belonged there, as if space itself had been waiting. My knees went weak. I gripped the port frame and forced myself to breathe. A second ripple followed, then a third. Not reinforcements, escorts, smaller vessels, each the size of a Conclave cruiser, slid into formation around the wedge like wolves flanking an apex predator. They did not broadcast Conclave transponder codes. They did not request docking clearance. They did not acknowledge the Conclave. They simply arrived. My console screamed silently with alerts I had muted without thinking: radiation anomalies, unknown drive signatures, encrypted emissions. I whispered, unable to help myself. What are you? The ship answered without words. It lit, not with a beacon, but with lines of pale gold that traced across its hull like veins, forming symbols that pricked at my mind. Human characters. My translator supplied letters arranged into a name so old it felt like an epitaph. Uns resolute. Under the name, another line appeared, smaller, like a footnote that was also a threat. Declaration platform Sol system. My throat clicked. A declaration platform was not a trade vessel, not an exploration craft. It was the kind of thing empires parked above worlds when they planned to change history. I did not understand. Humans had been surveyed by Conclave scouts. Their visible fleets were modest. Their orbital infrastructure was civilian. Their warships were adequate at best by Conclave standards. We had files, projections, confidence. We had calculated their desperation. And yet, the UN's Resolute sat above Earth like a dark crown, its presence rewriting every assumption. A chime rang behind me. I spun. The gallery door opened, and the human diplomat stepped in, escorted by two guards who looked suddenly uncertain. She moved past them as if they were furniture and approached the viewing port beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the ship. Her face in the dim light was carved from fatigue and restraint. The eyes of someone who had carried bad news for too long. "You're not supposed to be here," I managed, voice tight. She didn't look at me. "Neither are you. Is that yours?" "It's ours," she said. Our could mean many things. A nation, a coalition, a species. In conclave politics, it usually meant a lie big enough to stand on. But the ship outside did not look like a lie. I swallowed. "You told them to bring enough to end it." "Yes." "You have enough?" Her jaw flexed. "We have enough to make them listen." A tremor passed through the station's superstructure, a subtle vibration, like a drumbeat transmitted through metal. The conclave station's sensors recalibrated. Emergency lights blinked once. Somewhere far below, alarms began to wail. On the viewing port, a new emission bloomed from the UN's Resolute, a narrow beam, invisible to my eyes but obvious to the instruments, aimed not at Earth, but at the conclave diplomatic station, at us. The guards stiffened. One reached for a cum. The other took a half step back, as if distance could protect him. The human diplomat finally turned her head toward me. Her expression held no triumph, no cruelty, only a kind of grim mercy. "I warned you," she said softly. "Now, you get to decide what warning means." My console flashed a translation of an incoming transmission, forcing itself past our encryption like a knife through cloth. A human voice filled the gallery, deep, steady, carrying the weight of command without theatrics. "This is Admiral Mara Vance of the United Nations Dreadnought UN's Resolute," the voice said. "Conclave leadership, you have 10 minutes to rescind your containment order and withdraw all directorate assets from Sol system." A pause. "The kind that makes hearts stop." "Refuse," the Admiral continued, "and we will demonstrate why Earth does not bluff." The station shook again, harder this time, like something immense had just locked its attention onto us. And outside the glass, the Dreadnought's golden lines brightened. As if waking, I stared at it, at the impossible mass hanging above a world we had called weak. My stylus, forgotten in my hand, snapped in half, because in that moment, with the conclave's alarm screaming and the human dreadnought painting us with its unseen weapon sight, I understood the first terrifying truth of humanity. They hadn't come to the conclave to join, they had come to measure how badly the galaxy needed to be corrected, and somewhere deep in the station, the conclave chair's emergency council was assembling, panicked, proud, and very capable of choosing the worst possible answer. The 10-minute countdown began. On my console, a new alert appeared: Directorate Warfleet entering Sol system at high velocity, and the human diplomat beside me whispered, almost like a prayer, "Too late." The conclave station had been built in an age when diplomacy still pretended to be sacred. From the outside, it resembled a jeweled ring around a dead moon, arches, domes, luminous struts that served no structural purpose except to declare, "We can afford beauty in the void." Inside, corridors were wide enough for ceremonial processions, walls inlaid with the mineral signatures of 37 worlds. The air composition shifted by district, tuned to the comfort of whichever species had paid most recently for renovations. It was a monument to compromise. It was also a trap, because the conclave did not conquer with flags. It conquered with ledgers. Long before the humans stepped into our chamber, long before the Tyrone Directorate's emissary sneered the word "beg," the Conclave had perfected an art, turning hunger into policy. First came the infrastructure loans, then the security accords, then the tariff harmonization, and then, when a world's economy depended on Conclave lanes and Conclave credit, the Conclave could tighten a single clause and watch a planet's sovereignty collapse without firing a shot. The Tyrune had refined this into something almost elegant. They were not the Conclave's rulers, no one officially ruled, but they were the ones who kept the Conclave's teeth sharp. Their directorate fleets enforced charter compliance. Their auditors wrote stability recommendations that always required a garrison. Their envoys smiled as they signed away other species' rights. They called it order. Among the near, we called it a slow strangling, quiet enough that no one could claim they heard it. I had grown up on Nearil, a world of cold oceans and living stone reefs. Our first contact with the Conclave had been a miracle, then a relief, then an obligation. The trade lanes brought medicines that saved thousands. The navigation data ended a century of ship losses. The Conclave's development package built orbital elevators in a single cycle, and in exchange, we were asked to host inspection teams, to align our laws with charter standards, to accept a directorate advisory cadre. By the time our elders realized the pattern had become our economy. Record keepers like me were trained to describe this without anger. We used neutral verbs: integrated, harmonize, stabilized. The Conclave loved neutral verbs. Neutral verbs never screamed. But now, as alarms bled through the station's ceremonial corridors, and the air tasted of ionized fear, neutrality felt like a lie we told to keep breathing. In the emergency council chamber, the Conclave's real face gathered. Chair Sul of the Vesh sat at the center, a thin-bodied elder whose species had evolved in high gravity and learned patience as survival. The Vesh were older than most, and they liked to remind everyone that the Conclave began as their peace league before it became an empire disguised as an alliance. Sul's eyes were pale, almost translucent, and they missed nothing. To Sul's left, High Enver Keth Var of the Tyrune Directorate radiated controlled contempt, even while his aides whispered urgent sensor updates into his ear. Tyrune were built like armored mantises, their chitin polished to a mirror sheen, their posture always a fraction to forward, like they were perpetually stepping into your space. On Sul's right sat two Carvax Guild factors, mercantile, fleshy, adorned in gold implants that doubled as secure cum nodes. The Carvax didn't care who ruled as long as the shipments flowed. And behind them, like shadows, the compact representatives and minor powers watched with the expression of prey, trying to decide whether to bolt or pretend to be invisible. I stood along the wall with other functionaries, my slate tucked close, my heart thudding against my ribs. A record keeper's job was to observe, to witness, to make the chaos into something history could digest. I had never wanted to vomit while writing before. A Hall of Sol system hovered over the council table. Earth sat near the center, a blue dot. The UN's Resolute was a black wedge icon locked into orbit. And beyond the heliopause boundary, a cluster of red markers burned. Tyrune Containment Group. Arriving. Time to intercept? Chair Sul asked, and aide answered, voice tight. 7 minutes until Directorate assets breach Sol inner perimeter. Sul's gaze flicked to Keth Var. The humans have issued an ultimatum. Keth Var's mandibles twitched. A theatrical flourish. Nothing more. One of the Carvax factors made a wet, nervous sound. Our sensors disagree. That Dreadnought's energy containment is beyond Conclave classification. Our analysts can't model its drive. If we provoke, Keth Var cut him off. The Conclave's authority cannot be challenged by a frontier species with a single oversized hull. Single? A compact representative murmured before he could stop himself. We detected accompanying escorts. Keth Var's spines flared. Escorts are irrelevant. Sul's voice was quiet. Nothing is irrelevant when it points a weapon at our station. That was the heart of it. Not Earth. Not the charter. Not resources. In the Conclave, authority was oxygen. If a new species could refuse a clause and back it with force, then every integrated world would begin asking whether their own collars were necessary. The Conclave's unity would fray. Trade lanes would become battlegrounds. The Directorate would have to actually conquer openly, and open conquest was expensive. Keth Var knew this. Sewell knew this. They were not debating Earth's guilt. They were debating what precedent would cost less. I found myself thinking of the human diplomats I study, tired, merciful. We came to warn you. Sewell raised a claw. Open a channel to Earth's dreadnought, and Aide hesitated. Chair, the transmission protocol is unknown. They're forcing signal through our encryption barriers, then accept their override, Sewell said. We will speak on whatever terms exist. Pride does not keep stations intact. Keth Var's head snapped toward him. Chair, Sewell's pale eyes didn't blink. Your fleets are already in motion. If you want to stop them, do it now. If you want to test Earth's bluff, understand that we are the anvil your hammer will strike. This council will not die to preserve your posture. That landed like a slap. Several delegates stiffened. The Carvax factors exchanged glances and quietly activated recording implants. Merchants always wanted proof for later negotiations. The CUM system chimed as it adapted painfully, reluctantly to the human signal. The room's air seemed to thicken, as if the station itself held breath. A human face appeared in the hall, a female, older than the diplomat, hair cut close, eyes like polished stone. Behind her, dim red lighting and steel corridors hinted at a ship built for war, not ceremony. This is Admiral Mara Vance, she said, voice even. You have 7 minutes remaining. Chair Sewell leaned forward. Admiral Vance, I am Chair Sewell of the Conclave. Your ship is in an authorized orbit over a non-member world. Vance's expression didn't change. Earth is not a non-member world. Earth is a sovereign civilization. We requested equal terms. Your Directorate answered with the containment order. Keth Var leaned into frame, forcing himself into the conversation like a blade. Containment is a lawful response to refusal. Vance's gaze shifted to him with chilling precision. You don't get to define lawful for us. Keth Var's mandibles spread in a smile that was all threat. Then you will learn what isolation costs. You have one dreadnought. We have fleets. A murmur ran through the council. It was the kind of line that usually ended negotiations. The kind of line that made small species fold. Vance didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "You've never met us in a war you didn't start." For a moment, I felt something strange. Not fear, not admiration, recognition. That sentence was not a threat. It was a summary of history. Sewell held up a claw before Keth Var could speak again. Admiral, what are your demands? Vance's eyes stayed locked forward. Rescind the containment order, withdraw Directorate assets from Sol, and deliver a binding conclave resolution recognizing Earth's sovereignty and prohibiting forced inspection of our orbital infrastructure. Keth Var snapped. Impossible. Vance didn't even look at him. Then we demonstrate. One of the Carvax factors blurted. Demonstrate what? Vance's gaze finally softened. Just a fraction, like someone pitying a child who'd stepped too close to a cliff. The cost of underestimating us. The Hala blinked as new data pushed through. A live feed from Sol orbit. The UN's Resolute hung above Earth like a drawn blade. Its hull markings burned brighter, lines rearranging into new symbols. Chair Sewell's aide whispered, "They're charging something." Keth Var's voice sharpened. "Admiral, if you fire upon Conclave property, you will be marked as an existential threat." Vance answered, "I'm aware." Sewell's throat sac fluttered, an involuntary sign of stress in his species. "Admiral, we are prepared to negotiate. Give us more time." 7 minutes is generous, Vance said. You've had decades of practice strangling worlds. You can decide quickly. The channel cut. Not by us, by them. The council erupted. Voices overlapping. Species-specific stress reactions blooming, spines flaring, scent glands releasing panic musk, translators stuttering under the flood of speech. Keth Var slammed a claw into the table. Enough. Our fleets will arrive and remind Earth of reality. A compact representative hissed. Or they arrive and die. Keth Var rounded on him. Then they die for Conclave authority. The Carvax Factor's eyes widened. Authority doesn't pay replacement hulls. Sul's voice rose, a rare thing for him. Silence. The chamber quieted in ragged pieces. Sul stared at the Salhalla. His face was still, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen empires fall. Record keeper Sile, he said suddenly. My skin flushed pale. Chair? Your people were integrated early, Sul said. You remember the conclave before the directorate's dominance. Speak. What do you see? It was not a question a chair asked lightly. Functionaries did not advise. We documented. But Sul was old enough to know when rules were luxuries. I swallowed, tasting metal. I see a species that refused the first chain, said carefully, and brought proof they cannot be chained quietly. Kethvar made a sound of disgust. Proof? A ship is proof of nothing. I forced myself to meet his gaze. With respect, High Envoy, your own posture says otherwise. If it were nothing, you wouldn't be angry. You'd be amused. The chamber went very still. Kethvar's mandibles tightened. You will remember your place. Near. Sul cut in before Kethvar could escalate. Enough. We do not have time for domination rituals. He looked around the council. We have two options. We bow to Earth's demands and preserve the conclave's facade, or we test them and risk catastrophe. Catastrophe is unlikely, Kethvar said. They have one dreadnought. Sul's gaze drifted to the Sol feed again. Do they? As if answering him, my slate pulsed with the priority alert. Not from the council system, from the station's deep sensor array, the one that watched subspace distortions for early warning. The readout showed faint ripples for beyond Earth's orbit signatures, not matching Tyrone drives, not matching any conclave drives. A cold weight settled in my gut. I stepped closer to the sensor console embedded in the wall, pretending to adjust my recording angle. The display was coded, but I read patterns like prayers, multiple emergence points, staggered timing, a disciplined arrival sequence. I whispered, too low for most to hear. They're not alone. The nearest aide heard me anyway. His eyes widened. Chair, Sul's head turned. Report. The aide swallowed. Additional mass signatures in Sol outer system. Unknown origin. There, forming a pyramid. Kethvar leaned forward. How many? The aide hesitated, then spoke as if the number was poisonous. At least 12 capital class signatures. Possibly more. Our sensors are saturating. The chamber erupted again. But this time, it wasn't argument, it was fear finding a voice. 12? The compact representative choked. Kethvar's posture stiffened. Impossible. Our scouts, your scouts looked at what humans allowed them to see, Sul said, voice quiet and lethal. And it appears the humans are done allowing. Kethvar's mandibles spread in a hard smile. Even if they have hidden ships, they cannot match a directorate warfleet in open battle. Sul's eyes narrowed. Perhaps. But open battle is not always the point. That was the conclave's deepest hypocrisy. We preached stability while mastering asymmetry. Blockades, sanctions, pressure points. We knew a smaller force could topple a larger one if it struck the right artery. Humans, I realized, had been studying the same anatomy. A new alarm tone cut through the chamber, different, sharper. The station's defensive AI, a cautious system designed to avoid provoking incidents, was issuing a rare alert, targeting lock detected external origin. The UN's Resolute was aiming at us again, more precisely this time, as if selecting a point rather than gesturing with a weapon. Kethvar scoffed, but his spines betrayed him, lifting in involuntary readiness. They wouldn't. Sul's voice was almost a sigh. They warned us what happens when we treat warnings as theater. The council chamber lights flickered as the station rerouted power to shields. The floor vibrated faintly, field projectors waking. On the Salhalla, the UN's Resolute's golden lines brightened until they were almost painful to look at. The ship's silhouette seemed to sharpen, as if reality itself was aligning to its intent. Then the feed shifted. Earthside camera, pulled from human networks by the station's analysts. A coastal city at night. Lights glittering along shorelines. People looking up as a dark wedge eclipsed stars. The human broadcast audio crackled in, raw and unfiltered. A woman's voice, different from the diplomat, different from the admiral, spoke to her planet. My fellow humans, she said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. We have exhausted every peaceful avenue. We have offered friendship and been met with a collar. Tonight, we show the galaxy that our mercy has limits. The camera shook as sirens wailed in the background. People ran not from the sky, but toward shelters they had clearly practiced using. Practice meant preparation. Preparation meant expectation. Earth had expected this moment. Kethvar's voice lowered, suddenly cautious. Chair, order our fleets to accelerate. We will strike the Dreadnought before its allies can fully arrive. Sul stared at him. You will start a war on the doorstep of a species that built this in secret. Kethvar leaned closer, eyes like sharpened glass. If we do not, we lose control of every integrated world by sunrise. The Carvax factor whispered. Control is already bleeding. Sul's gaze drifted to the wall where Conclave charters were engraved in metal words about unity, mutual defense, shared prosperity. Beautiful lies hammered into permanence. Then he looked at me again. Record keeper, he said, what would your people do? My throat tightened. In my mind, I saw Nereal's cold oceans, the reefs glowing at dusk, my mother's hands stained with salt. I saw directorate auditors walking our docks, smiling as they counted. We would survive, I said. And survival sometimes means choosing the enemy who will let you keep your soul. Kethvar's mandibles snapped. Traitorous sentiment, honest sentiment, Sul corrected softly. Another alert flashed across the Hala Tyrone containment group entering Sol inner perimeter. The countdown was over. Chair Sul's shoulders sagged by a fraction, as if age finally caught him. Then he straightened with a decision that felt like a tectonic plate shifting. Open channel to the Directorate Warfleet, he said. Kethvar's spines lifted triumphantly. But Sul's next words froze the room. Order them, Sul said, voice like cold iron, to stop. Kethvar lunged forward. You cannot. I can, Sul replied. By charter authority, the chair may halt enforcement actions pending existential review. Consider this an existential review. Kethvar's eyes burned. You will fracture the conclave. Sul's gaze was unwavering. Better fractured than ash. The cum-aide's hands trembled as he issued the command. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then the response came back not from the fleet's captain, but from the Directorate's central command node. A single line. Cold and absolute. Directorate override. Enforcement continues. Kethvar's mandibles spread in satisfaction. You see, Sul's face went very still. He looked suddenly smaller, not in body but in authority, as if the Conclave's illusion had just peeled away in front of everyone. The Tyrone didn't enforce the charter, they owned it. Outside, through the council chamber's armored viewport, space remained silent and indifferent. But my slate pulsed again, insisting on being seen. The Sol feed spiked Tyrone warships accelerating, weapons charging, and the Uns resolute responded. Not with a shot. With a transmission, it punched through every conclave channel simultaneously, overriding emergency systems, spilling into private comms, into public broadcasts, into the very translation matrices that kept us from misunderstanding one another. Admiral Vance's voice filled the station like a verdict. Conclave citizens, she said, your directorate has chosen war. If you are not the directorate, you have one last chance to prove it. The feed cut to the Dreadnought's prow. A panel along its front unfolded like a cathedral door opening, revealing a core of blinding white-blue light contained inside geometric fields. My eyes watered. My skin flushed sickly pale. A weapons officer nearby whispered, "That's not a cannon." "No," I breathed, understanding with the horror that made my bones feel hollow. It wasn't a cannon. It was a system of physics engine designed to rewrite what space permitted. And the Dreadnought aimed that impossible light not at the incoming Tyrone fleet, but at the empty space between the fleet and Earth, as if preparing to remove the battlefield itself. The human weapon ignited, and the void ahead of the Tyrone warfleet began to tear open, a perfect, silent wound in space wide enough to swallow an armada whole. The first thing the Tyrone fleet did when the void tore open was accelerate. It was a predictable reaction. Directorate doctrine favored momentum over hesitation, close distance, overwhelmed sensors, forced the opponent into reaction instead of analysis. Their warfleets had broken 3 rebellions and 2 rival powers using exactly that principle. Momentum had always worked, until the battlefield itself stopped agreeing with them. On the Solfeed, the leading Directorate cruisers drove forward in tight formation, weapon banks glowing, shields layered in overlapping fields. Behind them came carriers and heavy lancers, their mass signatures dense enough to distort local gravity maps, and ahead of them, stretching across their projected path like a horizon that did not belong, the wound in space widened. It wasn't an explosion. There was no flare, no shockwave. Stars simply vanished inside its boundary. Light bent inward along its edges, as if reluctant to leave. A silence fell over the council chamber, so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the station's life support vents. One of the Carvax factors whispered, "What is that?" No one answered. The station's physics models tried to interpret the phenomenon. They failed. Then they failed again. Then they began returning probability errors so extreme that the system flagged its own conclusions as corruption. The Tyrone fleet did not slow. At 30 seconds to intercept, their formation shifted. Forward lancers angled their hulls, preparing to punch through whatever interference field the humans had deployed. Shield harmonics adjusted, frequencies cycling to counter unknown energy types. Keth Var watched the Hala with rigid confidence. "They are projecting a gravitic shear or localized singularity effect," he said. "Our lancers are designed to penetrate stellar debris fields. This is intimidation." Chair Sewell did not look at him. Sewell was staring at the telemetry. "Admiral Vance," Sewell murmured to himself, voice to low for the translators, "what did you build?" The answer came at the exact moment the first Tyrone ship crossed the threshold. It did not explode. It did not crumple. It simply stopped existing. One frame it was there, a lance-shaped hull, shield fields bright, engines burning. The next frame, the space it occupied was empty. No debris, no radiation spike, no fragmentation signature, gone. The council chamber erupted in overlapping shock responses, hisses, clicks, involuntary pheromone releases, translator lag. The second ship vanished 2 seconds later, then the third, then the entire forward line hit the boundary at once, their momentum carrying them into the wound faster than the fleet's command structure could react. Ships disappeared in clusters, formation lines collapsing into absence. Shield harmonics flared uselessly against nothing at all. The Tyrone fleet finally did what no Directorate fleet had done in recorded history. It panicked. Orders flooded their tactical net vector changes, emergency deceleration, evasive dispersal. But momentum, once embraced, does not forgive quickly. Vessels deeper in the formation slammed into the boundary before their drives could reverse thrust. Gone, gone, gone. Within 90 seconds, nearly a third of the Directorate's forward assets had been erased from reality. Keth Var's mandibles were open, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous, disbelief. "That is impossible," he said, voice thin. "Mass cannot be removed without a compact representative whispered hoarsely. They didn't remove the mass. They removed the space." The station's analysis AI finally stabilized enough to propose a model. Localized metric displacement. The humans weren't destroying ships. They were relocating the region of spacetime those ships were entering, folding it somewhere else. Somewhere the fleet could not survive. A weaponized absence. I felt cold all the way through my bones. The wound in space stabilized into a flat plane, perfectly aligned across the fleet's approach vector. Ships that attempted to flank it found the boundary expanding, repositioning faster than their maneuvering could compensate. It wasn't a wall. It was a moving deletion. On the Council Hala, the remaining Tyrone ships began spreading wide, abandoning formation discipline for survival spacing. For the first time, Directorate Command transmitted uncertainty. Admiral Vance, their fleet commander, broadcast on open channels, voice tight, "You are engaging in prohibited physics manipulation under Conclave war conventions. Cease immediately." The human response came seconds later. "Withdraw," Vance said. "You were told not to come half." No theatrics, no anger, just instruction. Keth Var slammed a claw into the council table hard enough to crack the surface plating. "Continue advance," he snapped into his private channel, overwhelmed their generator platforms. That weapon cannot sustain under massed fire. The Tyrune fleet obeyed. They always obeyed. Weapons lit across their formation, plasma lances, particle streams, relativistic slugs. The barrage converged on the UN's Resolute and its escorts. The Dreadnought did not evade. It did not maneuver. Its hull brightened along geometric lines, golden patterns shifting, redistributing energy. The incoming barrage struck and vanished into localized distortions around the ship, bent away or swallowed by controlled space-time curvature. Then the escorts moved. Until that moment, they had held formation like silent shadows. Now, they broke outward in coordinated vectors, accelerating with drives that produced no conventional exhaust signature. They moved like thoughts. Each escort targeted a specific directorate vessel, not randomly, but in priority order: command ships, sensor platforms, fleet coordination nodes. And they did something that terrified me more than the wound in space. They disabled, instead of destroying. Beams of precise energy lanced across the void, punching through shields at harmonic frequencies that suggested months, years of study. Engines went dark. Weapon systems shut down. Command uplinks died. Tyrune ships drifted, intact, but powerless. One by one. Why aren't they killing them? A Carvax factor whispered. I answered before I realized I was speaking. Because they don't need to, and because mercy, applied selectively, is a message louder than annihilation. The wound in space remained active, but it stopped expanding. It now blocked the direct approach to Earth, like a line drawn by a god. The remaining directorate ships slowed. For the first time, Tyrune momentum died. Admiral Vance's voice returned to the system-wide channel. You've seen what happens if you push, she said. Now, you're going to see what happens if you stop. The feed shifted to a wide Sol system view. The additional human capital signatures that our sensors had detected earlier were now fully visible. They weren't forming a battle line. They were forming a perimeter. At 12 different points along the system's outer regions, massive structures hung in space long, skeletal frameworks surrounding glowing cores. Each one was broadcasting the same spacetime distortion profile as the weapon the UN's Resolute had deployed. System denial platforms. Not a fleet, a cage. If activated together, they could cut Sol off from hyperspace entry, warp corridors, even relativistic approach vectors. Earth hadn't just prepared to defend their world. They had prepared to isolate their entire star system. Keth Var stared at the Hala, and for the first time since I had seen him, his spines lowered. You built a fortress, he said quietly, almost to himself. On the open channel, Admiral Vance replied as if she'd heard him. We built a door, she said. It only locks if someone tries to kick it in. Chair Sul exhaled slowly, the sound almost a hiss. They prepared for invasion before first contact, he murmured. Yes, I said, because now I understood something else about humans. They hadn't hidden their strength because they were weak. They had hidden it because they didn't want anyone to feel threatened. Until threat arrived. The Tyrune fleet commander's voice returned, stripped of arrogance. Admiral Vance, he said, we are holding position. Good, Vance replied. Now stand down your weapons. A pause. Then, one by one, directorate ships powered down their primary batteries in the council chamber. No one spoke. This was the moment where the Conclave's illusion cracked audibly. The directorate's fleets enforced policy, and the directorate's fleets had just been forced to stop. Keth Var's private channel chimed. He listened, expression tightening, then snapped it closed. They're requesting withdrawal authorization, he said flatly. Sul looked at him. Give it. Keth Var's eyes burned. If we retreat now, every integrated world will know the directorate can be resisted. Sul's voice was tired and iron hard. If you don't retreat, there may not be a directorate left to resist. Silence stretched between them. Then Keth Var turned back to his channel. His mandibles moved once. Withdraw, he ordered. On the Sol feed, Tyrune ships began turning away, engines spooling for exit vectors. The wound in space faded as they retreated, the boundary dissolving back into normal starlight. The system denial platforms powered down in sequence. The cage opened. Earth had just won a war without firing a lethal shot at a single surviving enemy vessel, and that terrified me more than if they had burned the fleet, because it meant their objective had never been destruction, it had been demonstration. Admiral Vance's final transmission filled the chamber. "Conclave leadership," she said, voice steady. "You now understand our defensive capacity. You also understand our restraint." The hala shifted back to earth clouds, oceans, fragile blue. "We don't want your empire," she continued. "We don't want your resources. We don't want your submission." A pause. "We want you to stop doing to other worlds what you tried to do to us." In the council chamber, every delegate understood what she was really saying. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was an ultimatum about how the galaxy would work. Cathvar leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. "You think one victory gives you the right to rewrite Conclave law?" Vance met his gaze across light years. "No," she said. Then she added the words that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "We think what comes next will." My slate flashed with a new deep space alert. Not from Sol. From 3 different integrated systems across Conclave territory, systems where Directorate advisory fleets were currently stationed. Each alert carried the same signature: human spacetime distortion, multiple Dreadnought scale mass readings. They weren't reinforcing Sol. They were deploying everywhere the Conclave had ever enforced compliance. Chair Sul stared at the expanding list of alerts, his ancient eyes reflecting the end of an era. "They weren't preparing to defend Earth," he whispered. I finished the thought for him. "They were preparing to break the Empire." A priority transmission from one of the integrated worlds cut into the chamber, its governor's voice shaking. "Directorate forces are surrounded by human ships, and they're broadcasting an evacuation order for us." The governor's transmission did not end cleanly. It dissolved into static and overlapping voices, orders shouted in 2 languages, emergency sirens, the rising pitch of a population realizing that the power which had ruled their skies for decades was no longer the only power present. In the council chamber, no one moved, because the message had contained a word that did not belong in Conclave doctrine: evacuation. The Conclave did not evacuate populations. It relocated labor pools. It reassigned economic zones. It optimized demographics. Evacuation implied danger, and danger implied that whatever the humans were doing, they were preparing for something that might hurt civilians. That meant they were planning beyond intimidation. My slate filled with additional priority feeds as system after system began reporting the same pattern. Integrated world. Lathis Directorate garrison surrounded by unknown human vessels. Civilian broadcasts interrupted by translated advisory: remain indoors. Do not approach Directorate installations. Integrated world. Cartel human ships broadcasting medical channel access and emergency shelter coordinates. Integrated world. Near ill. My home. The words blurred for a moment before I forced my eyes to focus. Unknown human fleet elements in high orbit. Directorate advisory cadre requesting extraction. Human vessels transmitting environmental safety assurances in near dialect. My hand started to shake. "They're in my system," I whispered. Chair Sul heard me. His gaze shifted, something like understanding flickering across his ancient face. "They're everywhere," he said quietly. On the central hala, the Sol feed split into multiple windows. Each showed a different world. Each showed the same sight. Dark human hulls holding position just outside weapons range of Directorate stations. Not firing, not advancing, just waiting. The message was unmistakable. This was not a strike. This was a controlled dismantling. High Envoy Cathvar's composure finally cracked. "This is an invasion," he snapped. "Coordinated penetration across multiple sovereign jurisdictions without authorization. This is an act of war against the Conclave." From the Sol channel, Admiral Vance responded immediately. "No," she said. "This is an act of containment." The word hit the chamber like a physical blow. Containment. The same word the Directorate had used for Earth. Cathvar leaned forward. Voice sharp. "You dare mirror our legal language?" "We studied your legal language," Vance replied, very carefully. Chair Sul spoke before Cathvar could respond. "What are you containing, Admiral?" There was a long pause. When Vance answered, her voice had changed, not softer, not louder, but heavier. The Directorate's monopoly on coercion. Silence spread through the chamber like frost. On the multi-system feeds, new data overlays appeared. Human vessels were not only surrounding Directorate forces, they were deploying small craft toward planetary surfaces, emergency landings, medical shuttles, engineering teams. On Cartel, a camera captured human personnel assisting local workers to stabilize a failing orbital elevator that had been operating beyond safe tolerances under Directorate production quotas. On Lathis, human medics were treating injuries at a mining complex after a Directorate security withdrawal caused a panic stampede. On Near Ill, a human broadcast in our language repeated, "We are not here to occupy. We are here to ensure no one is harmed while Directorate forces withdraw." I felt something break loose inside my chest. Not relief. Not hope. Something more dangerous. Chair Sul watched the feeds with the stillness of someone witnessing the collapse of a long-held assumption. "They're not replacing the Directorate," he murmured. "No," I said. "They're making the Directorate unnecessary." Keth Var turned on us, fury returning like a survival reflex. "Do not be naive. This is soft conquest. Aid today, authority tomorrow." Admiral Vance answered him again, as if she had anticipated the accusation. "Every system we enter will receive the same offer," she said. Directorate forces withdraw. Local governance resumes full autonomy. Conclave trade access remains unchanged. Carvax factors straightened at that. Trade unchanged meant economic continuity. No disruption, no leverage. Kethvar's voice dropped. Dangerous and controlled. "And if a world refuses your assistance, then we leave," Vance said. That answer was so simple that the translators checked it twice. Kethvar stared at her image. "You expect us to believe that?" "No," Vance replied. "We expect you to test it." In the chamber, the political calculus shifted audibly. Because if the humans were telling the truth, then they were doing something the Conclave had never done, offering power without attaching ownership. That was not how empires behaved. That was how something else behaved. Something far more destabilizing. A new alert cut across the feeds, this one from Directorate Central Command. All enforcement fleets ordered to regroup at Tyrone Core territory. Strategic consolidation directive active. Keth Var stiffened. "They're pulling back," a compact representative whispered. "Yes," Sul said. "They're retreating to defend themselves," which meant the Directorate understood something the rest of us were only beginning to grasp. This was not a series of local crises. This was a systemic dismantling, and it had been planned long enough to coordinate across dozens of light years simultaneously. I looked back. At the Sol feed, the Uns Resolute still hung above Earth, silent and patient. That ship wasn't the spear. It was the signal. The real operation had begun the moment Earth refused the Conclave. "Admiral," Chair Sul said slowly, "how long have you been preparing this?" For the first time, Vance hesitated, then she answered, "Since our first contact probe detected Directorate enforcement patterns." Kethvar's mandibles twitched. "That was less than 2 decades ago." "Yes," Vance said, "the chamber absorbed that. 2 decades. In Conclave time, that was nothing. In human time, apparently, it was enough to map an empire's pressure points, build a counterforce, deploy hidden infrastructure across multiple systems, and coordinate a synchronized political military intervention." My skin flushed cold. Humans didn't think in cycles. They thought in crises, and they prepared for the worst version of the future they could imagine. Chair Sul leaned back slowly. "You believed the Conclave would eventually turn its full pressure on you. We believed you wouldn't be able to stop yourselves," Vance said. "No accusation, just analysis." Kethvar straightened, anger returning as armor. "Then you misunderstand the balance of power. The Directorate still controls the largest fleet in known space. You've bloodied us, nothing more." At that moment, a new transmission forced its way into the chamber's network. Priority override. Origin? Tyrone Core. The hala shifted. What appeared was not a human face. It was a Tyrone Admiral chitin scorched, posture rigid, voice strained. "High Envoy," he said, ignoring the rest of the council. multiple unidentified human capital formations have emerged within outer defense range of Tyrone Prime. The chamber froze. Kethvar's spines flared. How many? The Admiral swallowed. More than at Saul. Behind him, through a viewport, dark shapes hung against the stars. Not one dreadnought, not 12, dozens. And among them, larger silhouette structures even bigger than the UN's resolute, system-level siege platforms. But they were not firing, they were simply there waiting. The Tyrone Admiral continued, voice tight. They are broadcasting a message on all channels. The audio shifted. Admiral Vance again. Directorate leadership, she said calmly, you have spent centuries enforcing compliance through economic pressure backed by military force. A pause. We're here to demonstrate what it feels like to be surrounded by a power that can end your sovereignty. Another pause. Now, we're going to show you something you never showed anyone else. The Tyrone Admiral turned his head slightly, as if looking at a secondary screen. His next words came out as a whisper. They're opening humanitarian corridors. Kethvar blinked. What? The Admiral swallowed again. They're broadcasting evacuation offers to our civilian population, in case the Directorate chooses to escalate. The chamber fell into a silence so deep it felt physical. Humans weren't threatening Tyrone civilians, they were protecting them from their own government. Chair Sewell closed his eyes briefly. They're not fighting the Directorate, he said. They're isolating it, and isolating a power from its own people was the most dangerous move in political warfare, because it forced a government to choose between pride and survival under the full gaze of its citizens. Kethvar's voice dropped to a low, raw edge. They think mercy will make us surrender. No, I said quietly. They think mercy will make your people question why you won't. The Tyrone Admiral's feed shook slightly as new alarms sounded behind him. High Envoy, he said urgently. They're powering something. A large-scale field generator. We cannot determine function. The sensor data pushed into the council feed. My breath caught. The energy profile matched the Sol system weapon. But this one was larger, much larger. The projection overlay appeared. If activated, the field would not cut off a fleet. It would isolate the entire Tyrone home system from faster-than-light access. Complete strategic quarantine. No trade. No reinforcement. No expansion. An empire reduced to a single trapped star. Admiral Vance's voice came back one last time. Directorate, she said. This is your final demonstration window. Stand down your enforcement structure, accept conclave reform, or we lock the door. In the council chamber, every delegate understood what that meant. The humans were not trying to destroy the Directorate. They were preparing to make empires impossible. Kethvar stared at the projection, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes, because if the door closed, the Directorate wouldn't rule the galaxy anymore. It would barely survive its own citizens. The Tyrone Central Command suddenly cut its transmission, and a new alert flashed across every system. Directorate Strategic Weapons Authorization detected. The governor's transmission did not end cleanly. It dissolved into static and overlapping voices. Orders shouted in two languages. Emergency sirens. The rising pitch of a population realizing that the power which had ruled their skies for decades was no longer the only power present. In the council chamber, no one moved, because the message had contained a word that did not belong in conclave doctrine: evacuation. The conclave did not evacuate populations. It relocated labor pools. It reassigned economic zones. It optimized demographics. Evacuation implied danger. And danger implied that whatever the humans were doing, they were preparing for something that might hurt civilians. That meant they were planning beyond intimidation. My slate filled with additional priority feeds as system after system began reporting the same pattern. Integrated world. Lathis Directorate garrison surrounded by unknown human vessels. Civilian broadcasts interrupted by translated advisory. Remain indoors. Do not approach Directorate installations. Integrated world. Cartel human ships broadcasting medical channel access and emergency shelter coordinates. Integrated world. Near ill. My home. The words blurred for a moment before I forced my eyes to focus. Unknown human fleet elements in high orbit. Directorate advisory cadre requesting extraction. Human vessels transmitting environmental safety assurances in near dialect. My hand started to shake. They're in my system, I whispered. Chair Sul heard me. His gaze shifted, something like understanding flickering across his ancient face. They're everywhere, he said quietly. On the central hala, the Sol feed split into multiple windows. Each showed a different world. Each showed the same sight. Dark human hulls holding position just outside weapons range of Directorate stations. Not firing, not advancing, just waiting. The message was unmistakable. This was not a strike. This was a controlled dismantling. High Envoy Kethvar's composure finally cracked. This is an invasion, he snapped. Coordinated penetration across multiple sovereign jurisdictions without authorization. This is an act of war against the Conclave. From the Sol channel, Admiral Vance responded immediate. No, she said. This is an act of containment. The word hit the chamber like a physical blow. Containment. The same word the Directorate had used for Earth. Kethvar leaned forward. Voice sharp. You dare mirror our legal language? We studied your legal language, Vance replied, very carefully. Chair Sul spoke before Kethvar could respond. What are you containing, Admiral? There was a long pause. When Vance answered, her voice had changed, not softer, not louder, but heavier. The Directorate's monopoly on coercion. Silence spread through the chamber like frost. On the multi-system feeds, new data overlays appeared. Human vessels were not only surrounding Directorate forces, they were deploying small craft toward planetary surfaces, emergency landings, medical shuttles, engineering teams. On Cartel, a camera captured human personnel assisting local workers to stabilize a failing orbital elevator that had been operating beyond safe tolerances under Directorate production quotas. On Lathis, human medics were treating injuries at a mining complex after a Directorate security withdrawal caused a panic stampede. On Near Ill, a human broadcast in our language repeated, "We are not here to occupy. We are here to ensure no one is harmed while Directorate forces withdraw." I felt something break loose inside my chest. Not relief, not hope, something more dangerous. Chair Sul watched the feeds with the stillness of someone witnessing the collapse of a long-held assumption. They're not replacing the Directorate, he murmured. No, I said. They're making the Directorate unnecessary. Kethvar turned on us, fury returning like a survival reflex. Do not be naive. This is soft conquest. Ate. Authority tomorrow. Admiral Vance answered him again, as if she had anticipated the accusation. Every system we enter will receive the same offer, she said. Directorate forces withdraw. Local governance resumes full autonomy. Conclave trade access remains unchanged. Carvax factors straightened at that. Trade and change meant economic continuity. No disruption, no leverage. Kethvar's voice dropped, dangerous and controlled. And if a world refuses your assistance, then we leave, Vance said. That answer was so simple that the translators checked it twice. Kethvar stared at her image. You expect us to believe that? No, Vance replied. We expect you to test it. In the chamber, the political calculus shifted audibly. Because if the humans were telling the truth, then they were doing something the Conclave had never done. Offering power without attaching ownership. That was not how empires behaved. That was how something else behaved. Something far more destabilizing. A new alert cut across the feeds, this one from Directorate Central Command. All enforcement fleets ordered to regroup at Tyrone Core territory. Strategic consolidation directive active. Kethvar stiffened. They're pulling back. A compact representative whispered. Yes, Sul said. They're retreating to defend themselves, which meant the Directorate understood something the rest of us were only beginning to grasp. This was not a series of local crises. This was a systemic dismantling, and it had been planned long enough to coordinate across dozens of light years simultaneously. I looked back at the Sol feed. The Uns Resolute still hung above Earth, silent and patient. That ship wasn't the spear, it was the signal. The real operation had begun the moment Earth refused the Conclave. Admiral, Chair Sul said slowly. How long have you been preparing this? For the first time, Vance hesitated, then she answered, since our first contact probe detected Directorate enforcement patterns. Kethvar's mandibles twitched. That was less than 2 decades ago. Yes, Vance said. The chamber absorbed that. 2 decades. In Conclave time, that was nothing. In human time, apparently, it was enough to map an empire's pressure points, build a counterforce, deploy hidden infrastructure across multiple systems, and coordinate a synchronized political-military intervention. My skin flushed cold. Humans didn't think in cycles. They thought in crises, and they prepared for the worst version of the future they could imagine. Chair Sul leaned back slowly. You believed the Conclave would eventually turn its full pressure on you. We believed you wouldn't be able to stop yourselves, Vance said. No accusation, just analysis. Kethvar straightened, anger returning as armor. Then you misunderstand the balance of power. The Directorate still controls the largest fleet in known space. You've bloodied us, nothing more. At that moment, a new transmission forced its way into the chamber's network. Priority override. Origin, Tyrone Core. The Hala shifted. What appeared was not a human face. It was a Tyrone Admiral chitin scorched, posture rigid, voice strained. High Envoy, he said, ignoring the rest of the council. Multiple unidentified human capital formations have emerged within outer defense range of Tyrone Prime. The chamber froze. Kethvar's spines flared. How many? The Admiral swallowed. More than at Saul. Behind him, through a viewport, dark shapes hung against the stars. Not one dreadnought, not 12, dozens, and among them, larger silhouette structures even bigger than the UN's resolute, system-level siege platforms. But they were not firing. They were simply there, waiting. The Tyrone Admiral continued, voice tight. They are broadcasting a message on all channels. The audio shifted. Admiral Vance again. Directorate leadership, she said calmly. You have spent centuries enforcing compliance through economic pressure backed by military force. A pause. We're here to demonstrate what it feels like to be surrounded by a power that can end your sovereignty. Another pause. Now, we're going to show you something you never showed anyone else. The Tyrone Admiral turned his head slightly, as if looking at a secondary screen. His next words came out as a whisper. They're opening humanitarian corridors. Kethvar blinked. What? The Admiral swallowed again. They're broadcasting evacuation offers to our civilian population. In case the Directorate chooses to escalate. The chamber fell into a silence so deep it felt physical. Humans weren't threatening Tyrone civilians. They were protecting them from their own government. Chair Sul closed his eyes briefly. They're not fighting the Directorate, he said. They're isolating it. And isolating a power from its own people was the most dangerous move in political warfare, because it forced a government to choose between pride and survival under the full gaze of its citizens. Kethvar's voice dropped to a low, raw edge. They think mercy will make us surrender. No, I said quietly. They think mercy will make your people question why you won't. The Tyrone Admiral's feet shook slightly as new alarms sounded behind him. High Envoy, he said urgently. They're powering something. A large-scale field generator. We cannot determine function. The sensor data pushed into the council feed. My breath caught. The energy profile matched the Sol system weapon, but this one was larger, much larger. The projection overlay appeared. If activated, the field would not cut off a fleet. It would isolate the entire Tyrone home system from faster-than-light access. Complete strategic quarantine. No trade. No reinforcement. No expansion. An empire reduced to a single trap star. Admiral Vance's voice came back one last time. Directorate, she said, this is your final demonstration window. Stand down your enforcement structure. Accept Conclave reform, or we lock the door. In the council chamber, every delegate understood what that meant. The humans were not trying to destroy the Directorate. They were preparing to make empires impossible. Kethvar stared at the projection, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes, because if the door closed, the Directorate wouldn't rule the galaxy anymore. It would barely survive its own citizens. Cliffhanger, the Tyrone Central Command suddenly cut its transmission and a new alert flashed across every system. Directorate Strategic Weapons Authorization detected. The alert did not come with sound. It appeared silently across every display in the chamber. A single line of cold system text that no translator softened, no protocol framed in diplomacy. Directorate Strategic Weapons Authorization detected. For a moment, no one reacted, because strategic weapons were not part of modern conclave politics. They were relics, last resort arsenals built during the fragmentation era, when civilizations burned entire star systems rather than surrender autonomy. The conclave's founding charter had outlawed their use except in existential defense scenarios, and over centuries, the weapons had become something like mythology. They still existed, but no one believed anyone would ever activate them. Until now. Chair Sewell rose slowly to his feet, the movement deliberate, ceremonial, and ancient instinct to stand when history turned lethal. Define authorization scope, he ordered. The station's Deep Intelligence Corps answered immediately. Directorate Code Class. Omega Response. The words drained the color from every face in the room. Omega Response was not fleet deployment, it was escalation beyond fleets. Keth Var didn't look triumphant. He looked pale. What have they done? A Carvax factor whispered. The answer arrived seconds later, pulled directly from Tyrone Prime's sensor net. The hala shifted. Tyrone Prime filled the chamber, an ocean world threaded with floating cities, orbital infrastructure layered in defensive rings, a civilization that had believed itself untouchable for 3,000 cycles. Above the planet, one of the Directorate's deep orbit installations opened. It was not a ship. It was a relic, a massive lattice structure surrounding a core the size of a small moon, its geometry ancient, inelegant, built in an era when power generation mattered more than efficiency or safety. My translator struggled before producing a classification. Stellar Ignition Array, a device designed to trigger controlled solar destabilization, not enough to destroy a star immediately, enough to make a system uninhabitable within months. Enough to threaten extinction. The chamber erupted. They wouldn't, that's madness. They'd burn their own system. Kethvar's voice cut through the noise, raw and furious. They're not targeting the star. All eyes turned back to the projection. The array's targeting solution appeared. It wasn't aimed inward. It was aimed outward, at the human fleet perimeter, at the quarantine field generators, at the ship surrounding Tyrone Prime. If fired, the resulting stellar flare would rip through the inner system, vaporizing everything in orbit and sterilizing nearby space, including human forces, including Tyrone orbital infrastructure, including millions of their own civilians. The message was unmistakable. If the Directorate could not rule the system, no one would. Chair Sewell's voice came out hoarse. They are threatening mutual annihilation. Keth Var stared at the feed, mandibles trembling. No, he said quietly. They are threatening to prove they still control the escalation ladder, because empires survive on one belief, that they are willing to go further than anyone else. The Tyrone Admiral's emergency channel forced its way back into the chamber. High Envoy, he said, voice breaking. Civilian panic is spreading. Evacuation corridors are overloaded. The ignition array is entering charge cycle. Behind him, through the viewport, the human ships did not move. They held position. One of the compact delegates whispered, almost in disbelief. Why aren't they retreating? I understood before anyone answered. Because if they retreat, I said, the Directorate learns the threat works, and once a government learns extinction threats work, it never stops using them. On the open channel, Admiral Vance's voice returned. Directorate Command, she said, calm as ever. You are about to kill millions of your own civilians to preserve political leverage. Keth Var leaned forward, desperation sharpening his tone. Stand down your quarantine field and withdraw your fleets. Then the array powers down. A long pause. Then Vance said something that changed the temperature of the room. Oh, shock rippled through the council. Sewell leaned forward. Admiral, if that array fires, we know what it does, Vance said. The Tyrone Admiral shouted into his channel. Charge level at 40%. On the Sol feed, the UN's Resolute began to move. Not away from Earth. Away from Earth's safety. It accelerated toward deep space. toward the location of the interstellar ignition array. Every sensor in the chamber locked onto it. Keth Var blinked. What is she doing? The answer appeared as new telemetry flooded in. The Dreadnought was not alone. Across multiple systems, every major human capital ship was altering course simultaneously, not retreating, advancing, toward Directorate strategic installations, toward ignition arrays, toward planetary defense cores, toward the infrastructure that allowed the Directorate to threaten extinction. Chair Soul's eyes widened. They're not countering the fleets, he breathed. They're going after the deterrent. The realization hit the room like a shockwave. The humans weren't trying to win battles, they were trying to remove the Directorate's ability to escalate. If the ignition arrays were neutralized, the Directorate's final leverage would vanish, and empires without escalation authority collapse very quickly. The Tyrone Admiral's voice rose, panic breaking through discipline. Charge level 60%. Human vessel approaching array at high velocity. Interception impossible. On the Hala, the Un's Resolute grew larger as it closed on the ancient structure. The ignition array began to glow, energy arcing along its lattice. The human ship did not slow. Admiral Vance, Soul said urgently, if that array fires before you reach it. It won't, she said. For the first time since this crisis began, there was emotion in her voice. Not fear, not anger, resolve. Because we built the Resolute for exactly this situation. The Dreadnought's hull lines ignited, gold patterns flaring brighter than before. The prow opened again, revealing the same white-blue core, but this time, the energy signature was different. Focused, compressed, directional. Keth Var leaned forward, eyes wide. That's not the spatial displacement system, no, I whispered. It's something else. The Tyrone Admiral screamed into the channel. Charge level 80%. Firing solution locked. We cannot abort. For a single heartbeat, everything held. Then both systems activated. The ignition array discharged first. A beam of star-hot plasma and gravitational distortion lanced outward, a newborn solar flare guided by ancient machinery, and at the same instant, the Un's Resolute fired. Its beam was smaller, narrower, almost delicate compared to the Directorate's apocalyptic discharge. The two energies met in the void, and the human weapon did something no one in the chamber had ever seen before. It stabilized the flare. The solar energy, instead of expanding into catastrophic eruption, folded inward, compressed, contained, redirected into a controlled stream that bent away from the system entirely and vented harmlessly into deep interstellar space. The ignition array's lattice overloaded instantly, its core collapsing under feedback. The structure went dark. The star remained stable. Tyrone Prime survived. The chamber was silent, not shocked, not relieved. Silent in the presence of something far more frightening than destruction. The humans hadn't just stopped a planet-killing weapon, they had overridden the physics of the attack. They had built a system that could turn extinction into exhaust. The Tyrone Admiral's voice returned, barely audible. The array is offline. Admiral Vance spoke to the entire network. We're not here to win wars, she said. We're here to make them impossible. Keth Var stared at the dead ignition array, mandibles hanging open, because the Directorate had just lost its last argument. If extinction threats didn't work, if escalation didn't work, then the only thing left was governance, and the Directorate had never ruled by consent. A new transmission came from Tyrone Prime's civilian network, and filtered millions of voices, protests, demands, questions. The people had seen the ignition array charge. They had seen who stopped it. Chair Soul sat down slowly. It's over, he said. Keth Var did not respond, because he was watching something else. The human ships around Tyrone Prime were changing formation, not withdrawing, moving closer, slowly, deliberately. And on every public channel a new human broadcast appeared. Admiral Vance again. Citizens of Tyrone, she said. Your government just attempted to risk your extinction. A pause. We're opening evacuation corridors to neutral conclave space. Another pause. And we're inviting your planetary representatives to request independent observer status. The words hit the chamber like a detonation. Independent observer status. Not under the Directorate. Not under the Conclave. Separate. Autonomous. Keth Var finally spoke. Voice hollow. They're not dismantling the Directorate. No, Sewell said quietly, they're dismantling the idea that anyone needs it, and once that idea spread, empires didn't fall in battles. They fell in votes. A final alert flashed across the chamber, multiple Conclave member worlds requesting human protective accords simultaneously. The requests did not arrive one at a time, they came as a flood. Priority channels lit across the Conclave network, system after system transmitting formal declarations, emergency petitions, provisional resolutions from planetary councils that had spent generations speaking only through Directorate intermediaries. Observer status request, Lathis autonomy restoration petition, cartel protective accord inquiry, Velaran trade coalition emergency governance referendum near-ill. My homeworld's name burned in the list. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke, because what we were witnessing was not military collapse, it was political gravity reversing. Chair Sol sat motionless, his thin hands folded, eyes half-lidded in the posture of a Vesh elder processing irreversible change. The Conclave, he said slowly, was built to prevent war by concentrating power. No one answered, because outside the chamber, that concentration was dissolving in real time. On the system feeds, Directorate insignias were being removed from orbital stations. Advisory cadres were requesting evacuation. Civil administrations, many of which had existed only as ceremonial bodies for decades, were suddenly issuing real directives. And above those worlds, human ships held position, not descending, not landing, watching, waiting. Keth Var's posture had changed. The aggression was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous for a Directorate official: uncertainty. They are offering protection without control, he said quietly. That is unsustainable. One of the Carvax factors turned toward him. Why? Keth Var looked at him as if the answer should be obvious. Because power without leverage is charity, he said. And charity does not hold empires together. From the Sol channel, Admiral Vance answered, "We're not building an empire." The room went still again. It was becoming clear that human intelligence was monitoring everything. Keth Var leaned forward, voice sharp again. Then what are you building? There was a long pause. When Vance spoke, her voice carried something new. Not command. Conviction. A system where power is too expensive to abuse. Chair Sol's eyes opened fully. How? He asked. The main hala shifted. Instead of fleets or battles, it displayed infrastructure maps, human installations across multiple systems, system denial platforms, strategic intervention dreadnoughts, stellar stabilization arrays, civilian evacuation networks, trade protection escorts, and layered through all of it, a dense web of monitoring stations, early warning grids, abuse detection systems, contract enforcement relays. They didn't build a military, I realized aloud. They built enforcement for everyone. Vance continued. No civilization should be able to threaten extinction to win a negotiation, she said. No fleet should be able to starve a world into compliance. No economic network should be able to collapse a planet's sovereignty. The hala zoomed outward. Human infrastructure wasn't concentrated around Earth. It was distributed everywhere. They hadn't fortified their home. They had embedded themselves into the galaxy's pressure points. If someone tries to coerce a world, Vance said, we show up. Keth Var stared at the projection. That makes you the galaxy's police. No, Vance replied. It makes coercion a losing strategy. That distinction mattered. Police enforce authority. Humans were enforcing consequences. Chair Sewell leaned back slowly. You're changing the incentive structure. He murmured. Yes. Vance said. If power stops working, systems change. On the chamber feeds, the political effect was already visible. Several Conclave minor powers were announcing emergency assemblies. Trade blocs were renegotiating agreements without Directorate mediation. Even some long-loyal Directorate client systems were requesting temporary neutrality reviews. Empires collapse slowly until suddenly they don't. Keth Var watched it happening. For the first time, he didn't argue, he asked a question. What happens when someone challenges you? He said. When a major power refuses your intervention. The answer came without hesitation. Then we absorb the cost. Vance said. The chamber processed that. Absorbed the cost. Military, economic, political. Humans were offering something the Conclave had never offered. Protection without immediate profit. Which meant only one of two things. Either they were idealists, or they had calculated that long-term stability was more valuable than short-term extraction. I thought of the dreadnoughts, of the system cages, of the ability to neutralize stellar weapons. Humans were not idealists. They were patient. Chair Sul spoke again. What do you want from the Conclave? The question hung in the air like a verdict. Because if humans demanded leadership, this would simply be one empire replacing another. Admiral Vance's image filled the hala. Reform your charter, she said. End forced integration clauses. Ban economic coercion backed by military enforcement. Establish independent system sovereignty as the default. She paused. And make those rules apply to us too. That last line hit the room harder than any threat. Keth Var blinked. You would accept restrictions on your own intervention authority? Yes, Vance said. Chair Sul's voice softened. Why? For the first time. Admiral Vance smiled. Not confidently, not triumphantly, warily. Because if we don't, she said, someone else will eventually build something bigger than us. Silence settled over the chamber, because that was not the mindset of a conqueror. That was the mindset of a species that had survived itself. My slate chimed again. Another message from near ill. This one wasn't a government transmission. It was public. A recording from my home city. Human engineers were working alongside local crews to restore an ocean harvesting platform that had been running at dangerous overload levels under directorate quotas. One of the humans slipped on the wet surface and nearly fell into the freezing water. A near worker grabbed them. The human laughed. Then kept working. No ceremony, no propaganda, just work. I realized my hands were shaking again. Because this wasn't power theater. This was operational philosophy. Chair Sul rose. The Conclave will convene Emergency Reform Council, he said. Keth Var did not object. He simply stared at the feeds showing Tyrone Prime, where civilian representatives were now openly demanding restructuring of directorate authority. Empires do not fall when enemies defeat them. They fall when their own citizens realize fear is no longer necessary. The chamber began to empty as delegates rushed to contact their governments. Only a few of us remained. Sul, Keth Var, and me. After a long silence, Keth Var spoke quietly. They planned all of this before we even noticed them. Yes, Sul said. Keth Var looked at the Sol feed one last time. At what point did they decide we were the problem? I answered without thinking. The moment your fleet started looking like leverage instead of protection. Keth Var did not respond. He left without another word. Chair Sul remained, watching Earth. After a long time, he spoke. Record keeper Sile, he said. Yes, Chair. History will say the Conclave faced a military defeat today. He paused. But that is not what happened. I waited. Sul's eyes remained fixed on the small blue world. We lost something far more dangerous, he said. What? I asked. Our monopoly on fear. Outside the viewport, the Conclave station hung unchanged, but the traffic patterns were already shifting. Directorate vessels departing, independent system ships arriving, human escorts taking quiet positions along major trade lanes. Stability was returning. But it was a different kind of stability, one that did not belong to the Conclave anymore. My slate flashed one last priority message. Origin? Earth Diplomatic Channel. Recipient? Conclave Historical Archives. I opened it. A single line. Request. Full access to all Conclave conflict records, enforcement archives, and integration case histories. Below it, a second line. Purpose. Prevention modeling. My throat tightened. They weren't celebrating. They were studying, preparing, because humans didn't believe the crisis was over. They believed the next one was already forming. Chair Sul read over my shoulder. They're planning for the future, he murmured. Yes, I said. A third line appeared in the message. Note, early simulations indicate emerging instability beyond conclave space. Unknown external expansion patterns detected. The room went cold. I pulled up the attached data. Deep range sensors. Regions beyond map territory. Movement. Not human. Not conclave. Not any known civilization. Large scale. Organized. Advancing, slowly, toward the galaxy we were all too busy fighting over. Chair Sul whispered, almost to himself. They didn't come to stop an empire. I finished the thought, staring at the distant movement patterns. They came to prepare the galaxy for something worse. A new alert overrode every channel across conclave space. Unknown extragalactic signal received, translation in progress.